It was one of those perfectly serene afternoons that seemed designed by the Almighty for the express purpose of English leisure. The sun hung low and golden above the hedgerows, bees hummed lazily among the lavender, and the scent of freshly cut grass mingled with the sweetness of scones cooling on a gingham-draped table. The annual Lavender Hill garden party had begun. Mrs. Penelope Hargreaves, the energetic hostess and self-appointed queen of the Women's Institute, had outdone herself this year. There were bunting ribbons fluttering between apple trees, a brass band on the green, and an impressive array of cakes vying for the attention of the village ladies. The menfolk, meanwhile, lingered near the ale tent, discussing cricket, local politics, and the state of the vicar's flower beds. From her wicker chair beneath a lilac parasol, Miss Jane Marple observed it all with her gentle, bird-like gaze. To anyone else, she appeared simply to be enjoying her tea, her delicate hands resting lightly upon her lap. But those who knew her, those rare few who had seen her at her most formidable, might have recognized that subtle narrowing of her eyes, that faint pursing of her lips. It was her way of storing away details. Who smiled too brightly, who avoided whose glance, and who seemed just a little too nervous for a sunny afternoon. "I do declare," announced Mrs. Hargreaves, clinking her spoon against her teacup, "this year's charity raffle is to raise funds for the church roof, and I'm most pleased to announce that the grand prize, kindly donated by Mr. Cecil Denham, is a diamond brooch that once belonged to Lady Denham herself." There was a polite murmur of admiration from the assembled guests, though a few eyes, Miss Marple noted, lingered on the velvet box longer than necessary. Mr. Denham himself, tall and urbane in his linen suit, inclined his head with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. His daughter, Clara, stood beside him, a pale, nervous young woman clutching her parasol too tightly. It was just as the raffle tickets were being drawn that the scream came, a single, piercing note that sliced through the hum of conversation and the trill of birdsong. The crowd turned as one. There, near the ornamental pond at the edge of the garden, stood young Clara Denham, her face drained of color, one trembling hand pointing toward the reeds. Miss Marple rose slowly, setting down her teacup with care. Floating face down among the lily pads was the body of a man. The sun glinted cruelly off the chain of a pocket watch tangled around his wrist. Mrs. Hargreaves dropped her fan. "Good heavens, it's Mr. Edgar Linton." A ripple of shock passed through the crowd. Mr. Linton, wealthy, discreet, and recently returned to the village after years abroad, had been the subject of many a whispered conversation since his arrival. Miss Marple stepped closer, her sharp eyes missing nothing: the disturbed soil near the pond's edge, the crushed lavender underfoot, and the curious absence of a hat. She sighed softly. The peace of Lavender Hill had been broken, and she feared it would not soon be restored. The panic that followed Clara's scream had a way of reorganizing itself into tidy chaos. The brass band fell into embarrassed silence. Mrs. Hargreaves clapped for order as if marshalling a choir, and someone was sent sprinting for Dr. Fielding. Two young men, stout fellows from the cricket club, ventured a rope to the pond's edge and, with awkward solemnity, drew Edgar Linton's body to the bank. Water streamed from his jacket. His pocket watch, still catching the sun, hung like a small, gleaming accusation. Miss Marple, who had seen sudden death before, let the crowd form its protective ring while the vicar murmured a prayer. She did not push. She attended. Clara, pale but rigid with a brittle determination, accepted a shawl from her friend Meg Templeton and kept her gaze locked on her father's cuff, which had collected damp and mud. Mr. Denham, for his part, had lost his urbane composure. He stood with one hand flat over his chest, the other gripping the velvet raffle box so tightly that the hinge left a mark on his palm. When Dr. Fielding arrived, breathless and irritable at being wrested from a crib game, he knelt with a practiced sigh beside the body. "Drowned, by the look of him," he said. after placing 2 fingers beneath the jaw. Though there's a nasty welt behind the ear. Could have slipped, could have been pushed. He glanced at the trampling near the water's lip and frowned. Fine ground to lose a truth on, he muttered. Sergeant Tom Dacre, the village's policeman, square-jawed, earnest, and rather in awe of anything that smacked of sophistication, presently appeared with notebook in hand. He began collecting statements, as he supposed a London inspector might do if one were present to approve his method. "No one to leave," he announced, not unkindly but with a resolve that made several ladies clutch their handbags as if passports were inside. By then the shock had fermented into talk. Gossip in an English village is not a flaw exactly. It is a mechanism, a way of making sense, like knitting. Mrs. Hargreaves, rallied by purpose, drew people aside for tea, as if a hot beverage might coax facts from them, one sugar lump at a time. Such a dreadful misfortune, she told anyone within reach, and at a charity event. Imagine the newspapers. She shot Miss Marple a look meant to be conspiratorial. "Poor Mr. Linton. I always said there was something sad about the set of his shoulders." "Sad or secretive?" asked Meg Templeton, who had a column in the parish newsletter and an appetite for adjectives. "He kept to himself. Lived at the old Hunter's Lodge, didn't he? The one with the September roses." "Kept to himself because he could afford it," muttered Mr. Wilkes, the grocer, whose sense of justice was tied to accounts rendered. "Cash on the barrel-head, and never a word of where the money came from. Abroad, they say. Argentina or the Canaries or some such." "Cairo," said Mrs. Pritchard, who made everything sound like a confidence. "I heard Cairo, and that he had a wife there, or a sister. One never knows which in foreign places." She leaned closer. "Do you suppose a jealous husband could come all this way?" Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea she did not intend to drink, and allowed these threads to drift past her. The human tongue, she often observed to herself, revealed more by choice of stitch than by the pattern. Who padded their speech with romance, who crowded it with accounts. She watched Clara Denham, who sat on a wrought iron chair with her hands clenched around the shawl. The girl's face was composed in a way that suggested practice, not habit. Miss Marple had seen girls like that in church, dutiful daughters who measured their breaths lest a father hear an inconvenient sigh. Sergeant Dacre worked along the fringe of the gathering, questioning the cricketers, the band, the vicar's wife, and finally Mr. Denham, whose charm, though dented, had not deserted him. "Shocking," Mr. Denham said, low and grave. "Linton and I exchanged pleasantries not an hour ago. He admired the brooch for the raffle. Quaint thing, but valuable. Diamonds are sentimental magpies. They hold on to glances." He attempted a smile and failed. "You last saw him—" "Where?" Dacre asked. "Near the far path, just beyond the lilacs. He said he was stepping away for a cigarette. I advised him not to smoke among the hay bales." He laughed. Mr. Denham's eyes flicked once to Clara, then back to the sergeant. "I cannot imagine who would wish him harm." "People seldom can," said Miss Marple, mildly. Mr. Denham started, as if he had not noticed her approach. That happened often. She had a way of arriving in sentences half-finished. "We shall, of course, cooperate," he assured the sergeant too quickly. "Clara, my dear, you've had a fright. Perhaps sit in the shade." "I'm quite all right," Clara said, in the automatic cadence of those who have been told how they ought to feel. Dacre cleared his throat. "Did anyone see Mr. Linton by the pond before—" He gestured, apologetic. "I did," said Meg Templeton. "Well, nearly. I saw him on the gravel near the lavenders. He looked as though he'd lost something. He kept patting his pockets." "Hat," offered Mr. Wilkes. "He had a straw hat when he came, I swear it." Miss Marple glanced at the crook of the pond's willow, where a frayed length of twine dangled barely a foot above the surface. A neat bow had once been tied in it, the sort a tidy person makes when fastening a net to keep leaves from drifting. Now it hung, snapped. Near the bank, flattened lavender bore the ghost of a shoe's herringbone tread. It was not deep, more a smudge than a mark, but it suggested haste. And there, almost invisible against the damp earth, lay a sliver of something pale and curved. She stooped and, with the edge of her handkerchief, nudged it into the light. A pearl. No, not quite. A bead, milky and imperfect, the sort sewn in clusters onto a lady's glove or the edge of a handbag. She did not pick it up. She was not the police. Instead, she let her gaze follow an invisible line from bead to bank, bank to broken twine, twine to the shimmer of water. In St. Mary Mead, once, years ago, a village boy had held another child under honoured dare and then wept at the audacity of his own fear. The method was not dissimilar, she thought, between mischief and malice. What differed was the silence required after. Miss Marple? Sergeant Dacre had come up quietly. He had begun, in recent years, to treat her as one treats a barometer, not consulted in official manuals, but regarded all the same. "You saw something?" "Only people, Sergeant," she said, and the corners of her eyes softened. People often see what they expect of themselves in others. It makes for very pretty misunderstandings. "Tell me, do you know if Mr. Linton was left-handed?" Dacre blinked. "Can't say I do." "No matter," she murmured, and turned to Clara. "My dear, there's a bench by the rosemary hedge. It smells more comforting than pond water. Would you allow an old woman to sit with you a moment?" Clara hesitated, then nodded. They sat, and for a time Miss Marple said nothing at all. Silence, used properly, is a gentle pry-bar. At last the girl spoke, her voice so small it seemed it might blow away like thistledown. "I shouldn't have screamed," she said. "It made everything worse." "On the contrary," Miss Marple replied. "Screams are meant to tell the truth of the body when the mind cannot compose a sentence. How came you to the pond, child?" I saw Mr. Linton walking that way. I thought he might want privacy. I had a headache. I went to the shade. Then I saw he was floating." Clara shuddered. "I didn't touch him." "No," said Miss Marple. "I think you did not." She studied the girl's gloves. Thin cotton, trimmed with a row of small beads at the wrist. One bead, she noticed, hung loose on a thread. The row was uneven by a single gap. "You have a very careful father, Miss Denham." Clara's mouth tensed. "Careful," she echoed, and looked back toward the raffle table where the velvet box sat, its lid now properly shut, the glinting brooch asleep inside like a coiled cat. "Doctor," Sergeant Dacre called across the lawn, "will you be needing to take the body now?" "In due course," Fielding replied. "I'll send for the men. For now, keep the area clear." There would be statements, Miss Marple knew. There would be London called, perhaps, if the welt proved persuasive. The village would wrap its shock in theories that Linton had enemies, from abroad, that he had gambled, that he had been in love. She could already hear Mrs. Pritchard's Cairo gaining camels by tea-time. But under all the chatter was something lonelier and more English, pride and the shame it disguises. Pride in a brooch displayed, a daughter poised, a party perfect, shame in debts owed, slights remembered, a temper poorly put away. A breeze lifted the scent of lavender and rosemary, carrying it over the water, over the broken twine, over the bead in the mud. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. Human nature, she reflected, is the most reliable clock. It ticks and tocks and, sooner or later, strikes the hour. All one needs is to listen for the chime amidst the band's silence and the gossip's hymn. She lifted her eyes toward Mr. Denham, whose smile had returned to his face as though fitted there by a tailor. The barometer in her mind fell a fraction. The weather, she felt, was closing in. By the time twilight touched the tops of the willows, the garden had emptied of laughter. The bunting sagged, the teacups cooled where they stood, and what had been a festive tableau had dissolved into anxious whispers and the quiet trudge of villagers returning home. Only the constable and a handful of helpers remained near the pond, now cordoned off by a makeshift rope of bunting that fluttered uneasily in the evening breeze. Miss Marple, having offered her assistance to the Denham's driver in escorting Clara home, lingered at the garden's edge as the last of the guests departed. Mr. Denham had thanked her, of course, profusely, almost too profusely, but his gratitude had the polish of someone eager to return to control. Clara had allowed herself to be led away without protest, though her eyes had remained fixed on the ground, as if afraid that to look up might summon the image of the pond again. When the motor car disappeared down the lane, Miss Marple turned back to the scene, her eyes following Sergeant Dacre as he scribbled beneath the last glow of daylight. "Most unfortunate business," he muttered as she approached. "Dr. Fielding says he'll have the post-mortem done in the morning. I've to send word to county." "Quite right," Miss Marple said mildly. "The world rarely leaves us alone to tidy up our tragedies before asking for explanation." Dacre gave her a look that mingled weariness with respect. "You think it's murder, then?" she considered. "One does not like to think such things, Sergeant, but I rather imagine Mr. Linton was not the type to fall into ponds accidentally. He struck me as a man who planned his footing carefully." The sergeant nodded. "That welt behind the ear? Doctor's not sure what to make of it. Could have been a fall. Could have been a blow. Or both," said Miss Marple softly. "I once knew a case of a lady who tripped over her own cat. Quite fatal, and everyone thought the cat had done it on purpose. It hadn't, of course, though she had been unkind to it for years. Guilt and cause are sometimes neighbors, but not quite the same address." Dacre smiled faintly. "You do make it sound simpler than it feels, Miss Marple. I suppose I'll be back here at first light." "I dare say you will," she replied, and let him return to his notes. She remained where she stood, the scent of lavender and damp earth curling faintly around her. The moon was rising pale and thin, silvering the pond's surface. Somewhere beyond the hedgerow, an owl hooted, and she took it as her cue to leave. Yet as she walked home, her mind wandered, turning over the small details like beads between the fingers, the missing hat, the snapped twine, the uneven row of pearls on a young lady's glove. Each seemed ordinary on its own. It was the way they fitted, or refused to fit, that interested her. The next morning dawned over St. Mildred's parish in that uncertain way English mornings do after shock. The air felt too still, as though the village were holding its breath. At the grocer's, conversation was subdued. At the post office, Mrs. Hargreaves whispered more than she spoke, her voice fluttering like tissue paper. Word of the death had spread, and speculation bloomed where facts had not yet been planted. Miss Marple, walking toward the green with her basket, could not help overhearing. "They say he'd been to see the solicitor in Bath last week," Mrs. Pritchard confided to anyone who would listen. "Something about a will. Always a will when there's trouble." "Or women," said Meg Templeton knowingly. "The Denham girl looked ghostly, didn't she? As if she'd seen it coming." Miss Marple paused at the counter. "It's extraordinary," she said gently, "how swiftly people assume foresight where there is only fright. Poor Miss Denham saw a body in the water. That's shock enough without premonition." "Of course, dear," said Mrs. Hargreaves, lowering her voice in automatic apology. "We only meant, well, one hears things. They say Mr. Linton and Mr. Denham were partners once, years ago. Some disagreement over property abroad." "How very interesting," said Miss Marple. "Disagreements about property are a great leveller. So many friendships drowned in mortgages, I find." She accepted her parcel, offered a polite nod, and went on her way. By the time she reached her garden gate, a motor car she did not recognize stood outside her cottage. Sergeant Dacre emerged, hat in hand, looking apologetic. "Sorry to trouble you so early, Miss Marple," he said. "I've been to the Denhams' house, Lavender Hill." Thought you might like to know how things are proceeding." "How kind," she said, ushering him toward the small parlor. "You look in need of tea, Sergeant. I find it steadies the nerves far better than official memos." He smiled. "I won't say no." When they were settled, he opened his notebook. "Doctor's report came in an hour ago. 'Cause of death. Drowning. But he's sure the blow came first. Heavy object, maybe the butt of a walking stick or a stone. No sign of struggle apart from that." "Interesting," murmured Miss Marple. "And his pockets?" "Empty," said Dacre. "Wallet, watch, cigarette case. All gone. Robbery, maybe, though whoever did it left the man's ring on his finger. Gold, with an odd seal." She nodded thoughtfully. "A thief selective enough to take a cigarette case, but not jewelry. That suggests sentiment rather than greed." "What of the Denhams?" The sergeant hesitated. "Mr. Denham was helpful, but, well, not as much as I'd like. He said he'd known Linton years ago, yes, but claimed they'd only exchanged polite words since his return. Didn't seem surprised by anything, if you take my meaning." "And the daughter?" "Shaken. Said she barely knew the fellow. Miss Marple, forgive me, but you saw how nervous she was. You think there's more to it?" Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. "Nervousness is not always guilt, Sergeant. Sometimes it is protection, of oneself or of someone else. I did notice her gloves yesterday. Lovely things, though one bead was missing. White thread, I think, and rather new. A pity about that little imperfection." He frowned. "You think it matters?" "Imperfections often do," she replied. "They are the only things we can trust to tell the truth." Before Dacre could respond, there was a knock at the door. It was young Peter Gable, the errand boy from the post office. He handed Miss Marple a small envelope. "From Dr. Fielding, miss. Said you'd asked for his report from last month's parish meeting. He told me to bring it along since he's up at the Denhams again." "Up there?" repeated Dacre. Peter nodded. "Said the old man wanted him. Miss Denham's taken faint again, and Mrs. Hargreaves sent for him." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, accepting the letter. "Well, Sergeant, perhaps your next call should be to Lavender Hill." Dacre rose, sensing in her tone that gentle authority he never argued with. "You'll be there yourself, I expect." "Oh, I dare say I shall wander up," she said. "It is a lovely morning for Lavender, after all." By noon, Lavender Hill stood cloaked in uneasy silence. The Denhams' house, with its ivy-covered walls and neat gravel path, looked innocent enough, though Miss Marple thought innocence in architecture was much like politeness in men. It often concealed a draught. She was greeted at the door by Clara, pale and drawn, her hair unbrushed, her eyes hollow with fatigue. "Miss Marple, I didn't expect—" "My dear," Miss Marple said softly. "No one ever expects an old woman, and yet we arrive." Inside, the air carried the faint scent of lavender polish and something else, something sharper. Denham stood by the hearth, a decanter on the table beside him. His smile was courteous, but his eyes darted briefly toward the staircase where footsteps creaked, Dr. Fielding descending, adjusting his cufflinks. "Just a touch of shock," Fielding said briskly. "She'll be fine with rest." He paused to nod to Miss Marple, his expression unreadable. "Miss Marple? Always a pleasure." "The pleasure, Doctor, is never mine when it follows misfortune," she said. "But I'm glad Miss Denham is in capable hands." "Indeed," Denham said too quickly. "We're most grateful for everyone's kindness." Miss Marple looked at the decanter, then at the man's hands. Steady, perfectly steady. "Kindness," she echoed, "is often the first thing that disappears in tragedy. I do hope, Mr. Denham, that yours won't fade quite so soon." He met her eyes, and for just a moment something flickered there, something cold and brittle, like sunlight on ice. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, but in her mind the pattern began to take shape. There were lies, of course. There always were. But this one, she suspected, had been wrapped in velvet long before a man's body had ever drifted among the lilies of Lavender Hill. The afternoon at Lavender Hill lingered heavy, as though the very walls absorbed unease. Clara had retreated upstairs, and Dr. Fielding, after one last clinical glance, took his leave with brisk assurances. The front door clicked softly behind him, and silence pooled in the drawing room. Mr. Denham poured 2 glasses of sherry, one for himself, one for Miss Marple, though she only touched hers politely to her lips. "I do wish," he began, his voice controlled but faintly trembling beneath the veneer, "that this ghastly business hadn't overshadowed everything. Poor Linton. Such a shock. One never knows how fragile life can be until it collapses at one's feet." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "Life has a habit of collapsing at the most inconvenient moments. But I always think the real measure of a person is how quickly they attempt to prop it back up." Denham gave her a thin smile. "You speak as though I've something to prop up, Miss Marple." "Oh, I wouldn't presume," she said, resting her teacup delicately. "But you seemed quite certain yesterday that Mr. Linton's death was an accident. Now you seem less so. I always find it curious how conviction weakens when the night's rest is short." He turned toward the fireplace, swirling the sherry in his glass. The mind plays tricks after tragedy. One begins to imagine things, connections that aren't there, old memories stirred up. "Old memories can be inconvenient visitors," she said, her tone light, "but they rarely knock without reason. Forgive an old woman's curiosity. Were you and Mr. Linton friends?" "Business acquaintances years ago," he replied quickly. "A property deal in Tangier. Perfectly legitimate, though it ended unhappily. He felt cheated, I suppose. But men with his temperament always do. Temperament. Suspicious by nature. Always thought someone meant him harm. He had that sort of mind." Denham smiled again, as if the very idea of suspicion were laughable. "Still, he returned to the village, and I made every effort to be civil. Time heals most wounds." Miss Marple's eyes wandered to a portrait on the mantel, a young woman in pale dress, painted in the soft style of Edwardian days. "Your late wife?" He followed her gaze. "Yes. Clara's mother, passed some years ago. She adored this house. I've tried to keep it as she left it." Miss Marple rose slowly, moving toward the window. Outside, the garden stretched in careful symmetry. Lavender hedges trimmed to precision, a pond at the far edge glinting faintly in the light. "Such devotion to order," she said quietly. "It must be comforting in times of chaos." Denham said nothing, and for a moment the silence thickened again. Then, with a practiced sigh, he set his glass down. "I'll be honest, Miss Marple. The sergeant has been most persistent. He'll be back again tomorrow with questions, I'm sure. I only hope the village doesn't turn this tragedy into a circus." "Villages rarely require encouragement in that regard," she said gently. "But they do have an instinct for the truth if given time. Gossip, you see, is merely a primitive form of investigation." Her eyes met his briefly, and she saw the faint tightening of his jaw. A small sign, but a telling one. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple left Lavender Hill and took the path toward the village green. The air was sharp with the scent of lavender crushed beneath her shoes. As she passed the pond, a ripple moved across the surface. Perhaps a fish, perhaps merely the wind, but it made her pause. She could almost see again the floating shape of Edgar Linton, face turned from the sun, his watch chain glinting like a quiet accusation. She bent closer to the bank, examining the ground. The constable's footprints and those of the onlookers had trampled much of the evidence, but not all. Beneath a tuft of lavender, partly hidden, something dull caught her eye. With the end of her umbrella she nudged it free. A small metal clasp, ornate and feminine, the sort that might belong to a handbag. She turned it over carefully in her gloved hand, then slipped it into her reticule. By evening, she was seated by her own fireside, knitting in slow, thoughtful rhythm. Sergeant Dacre arrived just after supper, shoulders squared as if he expected reprimand from the elderly sleuth. "Miss Marple," he said, removing his hat, "I've had a word with the folks in town. Seems Mr. Linton withdrew a fair sum of money last week from the bank in Market St. £100, all in notes. The clerk remembers because he asked for them in small denominations." "How very methodical of him," said Miss Marple. "And where might those notes be now?" "Not in his house, that's for certain," Dacre said grimly. "I had a look round with the magistrate's permission. His desk was tidy, almost too tidy. Nothing out of place but a half-written letter addressed to Mr. Denham." "Indeed," said Miss Marple, lowering her knitting. "And what did it say?" "Only a few lines. I have considered your proposal and will speak of it in person. I trust you will act honorably this time. That's all. The rest of the page was blank." "Ah," she murmured. "Then perhaps Mr. Linton's fall was less accidental than Mr. Denham would have us believe." Dacre looked uncomfortable. "You think Denham killed him?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that men who speak too carefully often have something untidy beneath their words, but proof is another matter." She reached into her bag and produced the clasp. "I found this near the pond. It appears to belong to a lady's handbag. Not Clara Denham's, I think. Her gloves are of good quality, but her taste in accessories runs simpler." Dacre examined it. "Could be Mrs. Hargreaves. She carries that big satchel to every event." "No," Miss Marple said firmly. "Mrs. Hargreaves would never lose anything metallic. She's far too meticulous. This clasp is decorative. Foreign, I should say. A small flourish that doesn't belong in our village at all." The sergeant's brow furrowed. "Foreign? You think it came from abroad?" "Perhaps from someone who's been abroad," she corrected. "Tell me, Sergeant, did Mr. Linton live entirely alone at the lodge?" "As far as we know, though Mrs. Pritchard swears she saw a light there late at night last week and a woman's silhouette in the window. Could be imagination." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "In Mrs. Pritchard's case, imagination is a faculty both unreliable and terribly productive. But even so, there may be something in it. A woman's presence where none was expected can upset many an arrangement." Dacre looked uneasy. "You think a woman might be mixed up in this?" "My dear Sergeant," said Miss Marple, leaning back, "in my experience, nearly every murder has a woman somewhere in the middle of it, whether she holds the weapon or the motive. Men kill for pride, women for need. It makes them far cleverer and infinitely more dangerous." The fire crackled softly. Dacre shifted his weight, uncertain. "Then what should we do?" Miss Marple smiled, that small, serene smile that so often concealed an entire architecture of thought. "We wait," she said simply. "Wait and observe. The truth has a peculiar way of showing itself to those who are patient enough not to chase it." Outside, the night settled over the village like a dark shawl, muffling its gossip, softening its secrets. But inside Miss Marple's neat little parlor, a single light burned late into the hours. Every now and then, her knitting paused mid-stitch as her mind fitted one more piece of the puzzle together. The bead on a glove, a missing hat, a letter left unfinished, and the faint scent of lavender that clung too sweetly to deceit. The following morning broke with a low mist that seemed reluctant to lift, as though the village itself were unwilling to see the day clearly. Miss Marple awoke earlier than usual, her thoughts already circling the events like quiet moths around a candle flame. She set a kettle to boil and opened her curtains to the narrow lane outside. The air smelled of damp earth and lavender, a scent that, in the past, had always meant peace. Now it only reminded her of the pond and what floated there 2 evenings ago. She dressed with her usual neatness and set out toward the post office, where she knew the latest talk would already be brewing alongside the morning letters. As she expected, Mrs. Hargreaves and Meg Templeton stood at the counter, heads inclined conspiratorially. They stopped whispering only long enough to greet her with a chorus of polite tones that could not mask curiosity. "My dear Miss Marple," began Mrs. Hargreaves, her eyes wide with a kind of pleasure that only tragedy can give to certain temperaments. "You must have heard. They're saying now that poor Mr. Linton's house was broken into during the night. Imagine, right after his death. Such nerve." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied mildly. "That does suggest either great courage or great familiarity. Was anything taken?" "Nothing of value, apparently," Meg said, her voice brisk. "The sergeant was there early this morning. Said the papers on his desk had been disturbed and a drawer forced open. It's all anyone can talk about. Do you think it's connected?" "Everything is connected, my dear," said Miss Marple, "though the lines between things are often too faint for most to see at first glance." She thanked the postmistress and stepped outside again, the voices of the two women trailing after her like the hum of bees. Her next stop was the path leading out of the village, where Sergeant Dacre was inspecting the verge near the bend. He looked up as she approached. "Morning, Miss Marple. You've heard, I expect?" "I have," she said, folding her hands. "Our little village seems to be developing a taste for drama." He grimaced. "It's no laughing matter, I assure you. Someone went through Linton's study last night. Not a burglary, I'd wager. There was nothing to steal but papers, and that's what they looked at. Whoever it was knew exactly what to find." "And found it?" He hesitated. "Hard to tell. But we did find something they dropped. A scrap of paper, half burnt, in the grate. Looks like it might have been part of a letter. Bit of handwriting left. Linton's, we think. The words, 'He knows about Clara.'" Miss Marple's eyes lifted slightly. "How very interesting," she said softly. "Though I wonder, was it truly 'he knows about Clara'? Or might it have been 'she knows'? One's mind can play tricks when only half the truth is visible." Dacre looked uncertain. "Could be either, I suppose. But why would anyone burn it? And who'd risk returning there?" "People return to scenes of comfort as often as to scenes of crime, Sergeant," she said. "Guilt and sentiment are sometimes indistinguishable, particularly in the dark." He frowned, pocketing his notebook. "There's something else. Dr. Fielding's report came through in full. He's certain the blow that killed Linton came from behind, right-handed with some force. The angle's wrong for a woman, he says." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Men do have such faith in angles, don't they? I once knew a left-handed gardener who wrote right-handed letters but dug his flower beds from the left. A matter of convenience, not identity. Dr. Fielding may be correct, or not." They walked together toward the village green. "What do you make of the Denhams, then?" he asked. "You've the best measure of people." "I think," she replied slowly, "that Mr. Denham is accustomed to arranging the world around him until it appears quite serene, and that his daughter has spent her life ensuring that serenity remains unbroken. When such a pattern is disturbed, one finds remarkable reactions, sometimes even violent ones." They reached the corner where the lane branched toward Lavender Hill. "You're planning to call on them again," said Dacre, not quite asking. "I find repetition often clarifies what a single encounter obscures," she said. "People tend to grow careless with their lies when they think the worst is past." When Miss Marple arrived at the Denhams' house, she was shown into the morning room by the maid, a timid creature named Alice, who seemed grateful for any excuse to speak to someone calm. "Miss Clara's resting upstairs," she said softly. "Mr. Denham's out walking. He said he needed air." "Quite right," Miss Marple murmured. "We all need air when the atmosphere becomes too full." She glanced around the room, immaculate, of course, but something about its order felt forced. On a small writing table by the window lay a woman's handbag, the clasp conspicuously broken. With careful hands, she leaned closer. The design was ornate, foreign-looking, and the metal gleamed dully in the light. It matched perfectly the clasp she had found by the pond. For a moment, she simply regarded it, the faintest sigh escaping her lips. Then footsteps sounded in the hall. She straightened just as Clara entered. "Miss Marple," the girl said, startled. "I didn't expect—" "I do seem to have that effect," Miss Marple replied gently. "I was hoping to see you, my dear. I wanted to ask how you were feeling." Clara hesitated, her eyes darting toward the handbag, then back to Miss Marple. "Better, thank you. The doctor said it was just exhaustion." "Exhaustion can take many forms," Miss Marple said, kindly. "The kind that comes from grief is very different from that which follows fear. One heals, the other festers." Clara looked down, twisting her fingers. "You think I'm afraid?" "I think you have been," Miss Marple said softly, "for some time. But you needn't be. Fear loses much of its power when it's spoken aloud." The girl's composure faltered. She turned to the window, her shoulders trembling. "Mr. Linton, he came to see my father last week. I wasn't supposed to know, but I heard them arguing. About money, something to do with the property in Tangier. Mr. Linton said he would tell the police if father didn't pay him what was owed. But it wasn't just that. He said he knew something about me. Something that could ruin father's reputation." "And did he?" Clara shook her head helplessly. "I don't know. Father wouldn't tell me. He just said Linton was a scoundrel and that it would all be settled soon." She turned, her face pale. "Do you think, Father, could he have—" Miss Marple regarded her with quiet sympathy. "My dear, love and loyalty are often tangled, but you mustn't leap to conclusions. Men like your father are very good at convincing others of their innocence, sometimes even themselves." The sound of a key turning in the door startled them both. Mr. Denham entered, his expression perfectly composed. "Miss Marple," he said smoothly, "what a surprise. I hope my daughter hasn't been troubling you with wild imaginings." "Not in the least," Miss Marple said, smiling. "I was merely admiring her handbag. Such an unusual clasp. Foreign work, isn't it?" He paused just long enough for the silence to sharpen before replying. "A gift from her mother. I'm afraid it's rather old." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly, her gaze lingering on his face. "Old things do have a habit of returning to us when we least expect them." As she took her leave, she could feel the man's eyes following her down the hall. Outside, the mist had lifted, and the sunlight lay clean upon the hedges. But Miss Marple knew well that sunlight often revealed more than it warmed. In her bag, the small clasp felt heavier than it had before. She did not yet know the full story, but she was certain of one thing. Beneath the lavender and politeness of this village, something long buried had begun, quite unmistakably, to stir. The following day brought with it an uneasy brightness, the kind that exposes rather than comforts. The village went about its business in lowered tones, as though the very sunlight demanded quiet respect for tragedy. At her cottage, Miss Marple finished her morning tea with a contemplative stillness. Her small table was neatly arranged. Letters from the vicar's committee, a note from her niece in London, and the tiny clasp she had found near the pond, now resting on a folded handkerchief as if it might speak if treated gently enough. She had thought much through the night, piecing together what little she knew. A man dead by violence, a father too composed, a daughter trembling between loyalty and fear, and now this foreign trinket tied somehow to a secret that had long outlived its discretion. It was, she reflected, a pattern of human nature she had seen before. Money, pride, and the desperate wish to conceal the past beneath the tidy embroidery of respectability. When Sergeant Dacre knocked just before 10, she greeted him with that same serene smile that often disarmed him. "You've been busy, I imagine," she said, motioning him inside. "That's one word for it," he replied, setting his hat on the table. "We've had a wire from the constabulary in Tangier, Miss Marple, about the business Denham and Linton had together. Seems they owned a small trading concern, imported antiques and jewelry mostly. Nothing suspicious on paper, but there was a third partner, A woman, Mrs. Beatrice Linton. Miss Marple's needles paused mid-stitch. Mr. Linton's wife, then? Yes, though she disappeared years ago. Some said she died abroad, others that she left him, the reports vague. But there's where it gets odd. One of the customs officials mentioned that certain shipments under their company name contained more than antiques. Jewels, smuggled through private collections. Likely wartime loot. Nothing proven, of course. How very human, murmured Miss Marple. Greed so often travels in fine packing. Dacre leaned forward. You think Denham's mixed up in it again? Maybe Linton came back to blackmail him. It seems probable, she said, but men rarely kill merely for money. It's the threat to their comfort that drives them to folly. Still, Sergeant, there is something that troubles me more than greed. He raised a brow. What's that? The handbag, she said softly. The broken clasp I found matches Clara's, yet she did not lose it by accident. The thread where it tore was clean, as if pulled by force. It might have caught on something or someone. Dacre frowned. You think she was at the pond? I think, said Miss Marple, she was nearer to it than her father allows. They set out together for Lavender Hill. The path curved between hedgerows, now humming with bees, deceptively peaceful. When they reached the house, Denham himself met them at the door, his smile thin. Sergeant, Miss Marple, I assume you bring news? Some, sir, Dacre said, clearing his throat. We'd like to ask a few more questions about your late business partner. You and he were once involved in trade abroad. Denham's jaw stiffened. A lifetime ago, and nothing that concerns this matter. I told you, he was a difficult man, prone to exaggeration and grievance. If you imagine I had reason to harm him, you're gravely mistaken. Nobody's imagining anything yet, Dacre said evenly. But it would help to know what he meant by writing to you before his death. Denham's eyes flicked just for an instant toward the writing desk. He wanted money, he said shortly. He claimed I owed him from our ventures. I refused. He made threats. I regret not reporting him sooner. It might have prevented this. Miss Marple's gaze followed his to the desk. You're a tidy man, Mr. Denham. I imagine you keep all your correspondence in order. I do, he said, almost defensively. Then you must still have the letters he sent you, she said mildly. It would be helpful for the sergeant to see them. For a moment, something flickered behind his eyes. Hesitation, calculation, and finally resignation. If it will put this to rest, he said, and crossed to a drawer. But as he opened it, Miss Marple noticed his fingers tremble. He drew out a small bundle of envelopes tied with string and handed them to Dacre. The sergeant untied them carefully. All dated this year, he noted. Yet the paper's older, yellowed, brittle. Because they're copies, Miss Marple said quietly. Or drafts, perhaps. The originals might be missing. Denham's composure thinned. You seem intent on doubting me, Miss Marple. I rarely doubt people, she said with a faint smile. Only their arrangements. At that moment, a sharp cry came from upstairs. Clara's voice, high, strained, frightened. Denham moved instinctively toward the staircase, but Miss Marple was already in motion, surprisingly quick for her age. Dacre followed close behind. They found Clara in her father's study, standing by the open window, a letter crushed in her hand. He was going to destroy it, she whispered, turning wide eyes to them. I found it in the fire grate, half burnt. It's from Mr. Linton. She extended it toward the sergeant. He wrote that he had found her, Mrs. Linton, alive. Dacre took the paper, his expression tightening. The edges were charred, but enough remained to read, You may tell Denham the truth cannot stay buried. Beatrice is here in England. I will see her tomorrow. Denham had gone pale. Lies, he said sharply. Linton was always a liar. Then why burn his letter, sir? Dacre asked quietly. Miss Marple stood very still, her eyes on Clara. "My dear, when did you find this?" "This morning," she whispered, "in the grate in Father's room." "And your father told you not to mention it?" Clara hesitated, then nodded miserably. "He said it would only make things worse." Denham's composure finally broke. "She doesn't understand. Linton was blackmailing me. Beatrice, his wife, wasn't the woman he pretended she was. She was involved in the smuggling, not I. When she vanished, he blamed me. I did what I could to protect my daughter from scandal." "Scandal," Miss Marple said softly. "Yes, that dreadful English word that has caused far more deaths than hatred ever did." The sergeant moved forward. "Where were you at the time of the garden party, Mr. Denham?" Denham's eyes flashed. "You can't believe I was at the pond," Clara interrupted suddenly, her voice shaking. "I followed him there. Father didn't want me to speak to him, but I had to know what he meant about Mother. He said terrible things, that she wasn't dead, that she'd ruined us all. I tried to stop him from shouting and he pushed me away. Then Father came. He must have thought Linton had hurt me. He struck him, I think, with his stick. It happened so quickly. Then the water—" She broke off, sobbing. Denham closed his eyes, a shudder running through him. "I didn't mean to kill him," he said hoarsely. "He slipped. I only meant to frighten him." Miss Marple's face was calm, but her eyes were sad. "It is often the case, Mr. Denham, that fear kills more surely than anger. And secrets, well, they rarely stay buried under lavender for long." Dacre laid a gentle hand on Clara's shoulder. "We'll take it from here," he said quietly. As Miss Marple stepped outside, the air smelled again of lavender and earth, the scent almost painfully sweet. She paused at the gate, looking back at the house. So neat, so orderly, and now at last stripped of its illusions. In the distance, church bells began to chime the hour. She walked home slowly, thinking not of guilt or punishment, but of the delicate, dangerous fragility of human pride, and how easily it could topple an entire life into the stillness of a pond. The evening settled over St. Mildred's like a curtain drawn too soon. The day's events had left the village hushed, the kind of silence that seemed to hum beneath the surface with unspoken conclusions. At the vicarage, a light glowed faintly through lace curtains. At the post office, Mrs. Hargreaves was undoubtedly already relating every whispered detail of the Denhams' tragedy to anyone within earshot. But in Miss Marple's cottage, there was no talk, only the soft, thoughtful clack of knitting needles and the faint scent of tea cooling on the table. Sergeant Dacre had left an hour earlier, escorting Mr. Denham into custody. Clara remained at home under the doctor's care, fragile and unmoored. The confession had been enough for the formalities of the law, but not, Miss Marple thought, for truth. There were small pieces that still refused to fit, edges too sharp for comfort. Denham's explanation, impulsive, accidental, had carried the ring of partial honesty, not whole. And the letter, half burned, lingered in her mind like smoke. Beatrice is here in England. If that were true, then the story was not over at all. She had just reached for her teacup when the doorbell chimed. Softly, urgently. It was Clara. The girl looked drawn, her eyes swollen from crying, her gloves clutched like a shield. "Miss Marple," she said in a breathless whisper, "I had to come. They've taken Father and I. There's something you must see." Miss Marple rose at once. "Come in, my dear, and sit down before you faint. You've had a dreadful shock." Clara shook her head. "No, I can't stay. It's not far. The lodge, Mr. Linton's house. I went there just now. I thought perhaps there might be something to help Father. I shouldn't have gone, I know, but I found something strange." The old lady studied her quietly, then reached for her shawl. "Well, my dear, if you insist on walking about in the dark, it's only fair that you take an old woman along to supervise. Lead on." They crossed the green under the watchful eyes of stars. the air cool and still. The path to the lodge wound through a fringe of trees, their branches whispering above them. When they reached the gate, Clara hesitated. The house loomed ahead, its windows black, its garden wild with neglect. "I left the door as I found it," Clara murmured. "It wasn't locked." Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of old smoke and disuse. Miss Marple set her lamp on the mantel, its circle of light revealing the disorder left by the police search, papers scattered, drawers half open. Yet beneath the disarray was something deliberate, she thought, as if someone had wanted it to appear disturbed. "Where did you find it, my dear?" she asked softly. Clara moved to the desk and drew from her handbag a folded piece of paper. "Here," she said, unfolding it with trembling hands. It was hidden under the lining of the drawer. "It's in another hand, not Father's or Mr. Linton's." Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and read. The note was short, written in an elegant, slanted script. "My dearest Edgar, the plan must proceed. He suspects nothing. Once the jewels are in hand, meet me where the lavender grows. B." She exhaled very slowly. "Ah, that is rather illuminating." Clara leaned forward, desperate. "You see? That must be from Mrs. Linton, the Beatrice he spoke of. She must have been here, with him. Maybe she's the one who—" Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "You mustn't rush to conclusions, my dear, but it does seem our poor Mr. Linton was not entirely the victim of events. This letter suggests collusion and betrayal. But if Mrs. Linton is alive, why hasn't anyone seen her?" "Because, my dear," said Miss Marple quietly, "some people know very well how to hide in plain sight." She moved to the mantel, examining the dust patterns where photographs had recently stood. A faint rectangular shadow betrayed that one frame had been removed. "Do you recall, Clara, if there was ever a picture of Mrs. Linton about the village?" Clara shook her head. "No, I never met her. Father only said she was ill for years before she died." "Died," Miss Marple repeated softly. "An easy word, when there's no proof required." She straightened and turned back to the girl. "We shall take this to Sergeant Dacre first thing, but before that, there's one more person I mean to visit, Dr. Fielding." Clara looked startled. "Dr. Fielding? But why?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Because, my dear, a physician is a most useful man in any village. He knows what ails people, even when it is not their bodies. And I've often found that doctors who serve too many secrets begin to look a little pale around the eyes." They locked the lodge behind them and made their way back through the stillness. At the bend of the lane, a figure detached itself from the shadows. Sergeant Dacre, lantern in hand. "Miss Marple, Miss Denham," he called, hurrying forward. "I was just coming to you. There's news. A woman's been seen in the village. A stranger. Mrs. Pritchard swears she came to her shop at dusk asking directions to Lavender Hill. Tall, well-dressed with a veil." "Did she say her name?" Miss Marple asked. "No, but she paid with a foreign coin, a franc old issue." Miss Marple exchanged a look with Clara. "Well, Sergeant," she said, "it seems your case has developed another heartbeat." They walked together toward the green, the air thick with expectation. Dacre frowned. "You think she's this Beatrice Linton?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that a woman with a veil and a foreign coin would hardly call attention to herself unless she meant to be noticed. That kind of boldness often comes from desperation or design." When they reached her cottage, Miss Marple insisted that Clara rest inside while she spoke privately with Dacre. The sergeant paced as she relayed what they had found. "This letter changes everything," he said. "If there was a second person at the scene, someone Linton trusted, it might explain the rest. Denham might not be the only one with blood on his hands." "Perhaps not," Miss Marple said softly. "But don't be too quick to exonerate him. I dare say he struck the fatal blow, though perhaps not the only one responsible for the death." He looked puzzled. "What do you mean?" "I mean, Sergeant, that a trap may have been set for both men, and one of them fell into it first. The question is, who set it, and for what gain? A missing woman, a vanished fortune, and now a letter signed simply D. It all has the look of something carefully staged, doesn't it? He stared at her, then nodded slowly. You think she's still nearby? Miss Marple smiled, her eyes glinting. I think, my dear Sergeant, that if Mrs. Linton truly wished to remain hidden, she would have stayed away. But she came back to Lavender Hill, perhaps to reclaim what was hers, or to settle an old score. And in villages like ours, vengeance, like lavender, grows best when rooted in the past. She folded her hands neatly. Tomorrow we shall call upon Dr. Fielding. I have a feeling he knows more about Mrs. Linton's health and her supposed death than he has ever confessed. Outside, the first hint of dawn began to pale the horizon, washing the rooftops in a grey, uncertain light. The village slept on, but Miss Marple did not. She sat by her window long after Dacre had gone, watching the quiet street. Somewhere out there, she thought, a woman with a veil was moving through the dark, and the truth, like the scent of lavender, was beginning to rise once more. By morning, the promise of sunlight had returned, though it brought little warmth to St. Mildred's. The air seemed watchful, the sort of brittle calm that precedes revelation. Miss Marple, neat as ever in her lavender cardigan, had already prepared a modest breakfast when Sergeant Dacre arrived at her cottage once more, his boots damp from dew and his expression strained. She was seen again, he began without preamble. The veiled woman, early this morning near the doctor's surgery. Mrs. Webb swears she watched her slip in through the side gate just before dawn. By the time I got there, Fielding said he'd seen no one. Miss Marple poured him a cup of tea, her eyes thoughtful. Doctors are accustomed to visitors at strange hours. It's possible he didn't wish to admit this one. Dacre frowned. You think he's lying? I think, she said mildly, that people rarely tell lies for no reason. The question is always whom they wish to protect. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I'll go back and have another word with him then. I shall come with you, Miss Marple replied, rising. After all, the good doctor and I are old acquaintances. He's less guarded with someone who seems harmless. They walked together through the village. The doctor's house stood near the edge of the green, its front garden immaculate. Every hedge trimmed to uniform precision, every flower bed clean of weeds. It was the sort of neatness that suggested an inner insistence on order, perhaps to keep chaos at bay. Dr. Fielding opened the door himself, his face composed but a shade too pale. Sergeant, Miss Marple, to what do I owe this early visitation? To the presence of a stranger near your home, Dacre said bluntly. You've heard the reports. Ah, yes, the doctor said, forcing a thin smile. Village imaginations. A shadow here, a shape there. I can assure you, no one visited me. Miss Marple tilted her head. But you were awake, Doctor. You've always been an early riser. He hesitated. I was reading, couldn't sleep. The affair of poor Mr. Linton has unsettled everyone. Quite so, Miss Marple said softly. Death has that effect, doesn't it? Especially when it's not quite as straightforward as it first appears. Something flickered in his expression. You have theories, Miss Marple? Oh, I never have theories, she replied with her familiar gentleness. Only little recollections. People I've known, situations I've seen. One learns over time how remarkably consistent human nature can be. The doctor gave a brittle laugh. Indeed. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have patients. I wonder, she interrupted lightly, if one of those patients ever went by the name of Beatrice Linton. For a fraction of a second, silence fell heavy as dust. The doctor's composure wavered, then returned as if yanked into place. Beatrice Linton, he repeated too evenly. The name means nothing to me. Ah, Miss Marple said. How curious, because according to the parish records, you certified her death 10 years ago. Mrs. Beatrice Linton, age 37, succumbed to fever while under your care. Your signature, I believe. Dacre turned sharply. You didn't mention that before. Fielding's hands tightened on the edge of the door. That was years ago, a routine matter. I remember nothing about it. Of course, Miss Marple murmured. Except perhaps that there was no burial. The body was never interred in St. Mildred's churchyard, though the paperwork says otherwise. That's quite unusual, isn't it? The doctor's silence spoke louder than denial. His eyes flicked toward the corridor behind him, where faint movement caught Miss Marple's attention. A shadow, slow and deliberate, retreating deeper into the house. "Doctor," she said gently, "would you be so kind as to ask your guest to join us? It's rather inhospitable to keep her hiding in the passage." Fielding's shoulders sagged. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, with a quiet resignation, he turned. "Beatrice," he called softly, "you'd better come in." The woman who emerged wore a dark traveling dress and a short veil, which she lifted slowly. Her beauty had once been striking, now tempered by weariness. Her eyes, grey, steady, faintly defiant, met Miss Marple's with an intelligence that needed no introduction. "So it's true," Dacre breathed. "Mrs. Linton," the woman inclined her head. "If you must use that name, though I've lived under another for many years. Dr. Fielding was kind enough to help me begin again." Miss Marple regarded her with quiet interest. "To begin again requires ending something first. I imagine your husband believed that ending to be quite final." Beatrice's lips curved faintly, though her voice trembled. "Edgar believed what he wished. I left him, for good reason. He was cruel, controlling, and when I discovered the smuggling, I feared I'd hang beside him. I faked my illness, and with the doctor's help, slipped away. He arranged the papers. I fled abroad." "And now you've returned," Miss Marple said, "just as your husband was found dead." A flash of pain crossed the woman's face. "I came back because he wrote to me. I thought, foolishly, that he wanted to make amends. But when I arrived, he was gone, and all the old lies had risen in his place." "Did you see him that day?" Dacre asked. Beatrice shook her head. "No, I saw Denham instead. He came to the inn where I was staying, recognized me at once. He was furious, said Edgar had told him everything, that he'd expose the truth about me unless I disappeared again. I told him I wanted nothing from him, that I'd already lost enough." She drew a shuddering breath. "He left. I thought it was over." Miss Marple studied her. "And yet you went to Dr. Fielding's last night." Beatrice's composure faltered. "Yes, I needed to see him. I knew they'd find out sooner or later about the certificate, and I didn't want him dragged into it. He saved my life once. I couldn't let that destroy him." The doctor's face softened. Beatrice was desperate. "I told her to stay hidden, but she wouldn't. She said she had to make things right." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Making things right often begins by making them known. But tell me, Mrs. Linton, you didn't come back only for closure, did you? You came back for something tangible, something Edgar still possessed." The woman's eyes flicked away. "The jewels," she whispered. "They were mine, part of my dowry. Edgar smuggled them out of the country after the war and used them to start his business with Denham. I only wanted them returned." Dacre drew in a breath. "And did you get them?" "No," she said quietly. "When I went to the lodge 2 nights ago, I searched, but they were gone. Someone had already taken them." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Yes," she said softly, "someone had. And I think I know who. The lavender by the pond, you see, had been freshly planted. An odd season for such work. Lavender roots quite shallow, which makes it useful for covering disturbed earth. I dare say, Sergeant, that beneath that patch we shall find what both Denham and Linton valued most dearly. Not just jewels, but evidence, papers, perhaps, that tell the rest of this story." Beatrice stared at her. You mean Edgar hid them there? I mean, Miss Marple replied, that Denham did, after killing him. But perhaps he never realized the one secret he buried would bring another woman back from the dead. Outside, the wind stirred the lavender beds beyond the doctor's window, their purple spikes swaying like witnesses. The case was not yet closed. Truth rarely was, but as Miss Marple watched the veiled woman bow her head, she knew the end was approaching. And, as always, it would come not with noise or triumph, but with the quiet inevitability of human nature revealing itself at last. The afternoon light slanted low through the doctor's study, gilding the edges of furniture and casting long shadows across the floorboards. Beatrice Linton sat very still, her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap, while Dr. Fielding paced near the hearth, his composure visibly fraying. Sergeant Dacre stood by the window, uncertain whether to treat this as a confession or an entanglement. Only Miss Marple appeared entirely calm, her eyes resting with mild interest on the glint of dust motes floating in the golden light. "I suppose," she said at last, "that we should be very grateful for lavender. It does so many things, freshens linen, soothes nerves, and occasionally conceals the truth rather neatly." Dacre turned toward her. "You truly think what's buried there will solve it?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "If not solve, it will clarify. Secrets, Sergeant, are much like weeds. The moment you disturb the soil, they insist on showing themselves." He nodded grimly. "I'll send a constable at once to start digging." "Not too many," she advised gently. "A large crowd around a grave, real or figurative, only makes people tidy their lies before the truth can breathe." When the two men had gone to arrange matters, Miss Marple turned her gaze back to Beatrice, who had risen and now stood near the window, watching the street beyond as if fearing what it might deliver. "My dear," she said softly, "you've carried the burden of false death a long time. That takes a toll on even the strongest heart." Beatrice's voice, when it came, was low but steady. "I told myself it was survival, but it feels more like cowardice now. I thought Edgar's death would free me, and yet here I am, trapped again, explaining ghosts to strangers." Miss Marple's expression softened. "The living are far more difficult than the dead. Still, you've done the right thing in coming forward. The truth, inconvenient as it can be, rarely leaves as much wreckage behind as the lie that preceded it." At that moment, heavy footsteps sounded on the path outside. Dacre returned, mud on his boots, his expression unreadable. "We found something," he said quietly. "You were right, Miss Marple." They followed him out toward Lavender Hill. The house stood brooding under a sky thickening with evening cloud, and at the edge of the garden, the patch of lavender Miss Marple had mentioned was half torn away, its roots clotted with dark, wet soil. Two constables crouched beside the shallow pit. From it they drew not jewels or papers at first, but a small wooden box wrapped in oiled cloth. Dacre took it carefully and laid it on the grass. The clasp creaked as he forced it open. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, lay a collection of glittering stones, diamonds, emeralds, rubies, each refracting the last light of day. But beside them, in a narrow envelope marked in careful script, lay something else. "Read it," Miss Marple said quietly. Dacre unfolded the paper, frowning. "To whoever finds this," he read aloud, "let it be known that I, Edgar Linton, kept these jewels not as spoils, but as proof. The man who calls himself Denham was once my partner and friend, until he betrayed me. He blamed me for Beatrice's disappearance when he knew well it was his own doing. If I'm gone, let this serve as my account." Beatrice gave a soft cry. "His doing?" she whispered. "What does he mean?" Miss Marple's face remained calm, but her eyes were sharp. "It seems your husband wished to tell the truth at last, but too late. He believed Denham had something to do with your disappearance, Mrs. Linton. Perhaps not your death, but your concealment." Dr. Fielding, who had followed them reluctantly, gave a quiet sigh. Denham did come to me once, 10 years ago. He asked for medicine, said his friend's wife was ill and would die without immediate help. I believed him. When I saw Beatrice later, I realized what he'd done. He'd brought her to me, not as a doctor, but as a conspirator. He persuaded her that her only hope of escape was to vanish. I arranged the papers, thinking it mercy. He promised she would be safe abroad. I didn't know. Beatrice turned on him, disbelief tightening her voice. You didn't know. You let him control me and then abandoned me to his lies. Fielding's face colored with shame. I thought you wanted it so, Miss Marple interjected gently, and Denham, having helped her disappear, found himself in possession of both silence and leverage. He would have known Edgar would one day suspect. When Mr. Linton returned, older and perhaps wiser, he likely confronted Denham not only over the money, but over the truth of his wife's vanishing. Dacre exhaled slowly. So Denham killed him, to keep it buried for good. Partly, Miss Marple said, but there's more to it than that. Denham was proud, terribly so. Pride can be more lethal than greed. When Linton reappeared, he threatened Denham's reputation, his business, and the fragile image he'd built for his daughter. Killing Linton wasn't simply about silence, it was about control. The same control he'd once exercised over Beatrice. The constables carried the box to the cart, and dusk deepened around them. Clara appeared at the gate, pale but determined, her eyes fixed on the small procession. "Is it true?" she asked. "Has it all come out?" Miss Marple nodded. "Most of it, my dear. The rest will follow as truth always does, by patient degrees." Clara's gaze moved to Beatrice. For a long moment neither spoke. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Clara said, "He loved you, you know. My father. In his way." Beatrice's lips trembled. "Men often mistake possession for love, child. But perhaps, yes, perhaps he did." She looked at the ground, and I pitied him once, which may have been my greatest mistake of all. A silence settled then, broken only by the rustle of lavender in the breeze. Dacre signaled for his men to finish, but Miss Marple remained standing, her eyes on the soft purple field. She spoke quietly, almost to herself. "It's strange how the past behaves. We think we've buried it deep, yet it blooms again in the same soil we tried to forget. That's human nature, rooted in guilt, watered by memory, and left to grow wild until someone dares to prune it." As they walked back toward the village, the lamps in the cottages flickered one by one. Miss Marple walked a little apart, thoughtful. The law would take its course. Denham's confession, the jewels, and Linton's letter would provide all the proof necessary. Yet she felt no triumph, only a quiet sadness. There were no real villains in this affair, only frightened souls who had lied to preserve their illusions, and in doing so had destroyed what little peace they'd had. When they reached her gate, Sergeant Dacre paused. "I don't know how you do it, Miss Marple," he said, shaking his head. "You make it seem so simple." "It's never simple," she replied softly. "People rarely are. One only has to listen long enough to hear the same tune repeated in every heart." He nodded, tipping his hat before turning down the lane. Inside, Miss Marple set her lamp upon the table and looked out the window toward Lavender Hill, now no more than a shadow on the horizon. She thought of Clara, of Beatrice, of the two men whose pride had chained them both. Then she closed her curtains gently, murmuring, "Poor things. Poor all of them." And as she sat by her fire, the scent of lavender drifted faintly through the open window, sweet, calm, and faintly bitter, like memory itself. The next morning arrived pale and quiet, as though the village itself were reluctant to stir from uneasy dreams. Mist drifted low over the hedgerows, softening the outlines of cottages and turning Lavender Hill into a vague silhouette beyond the fields. In Miss Marple's sitting room, the fire had long since burned to embers, but she sat before it all the same, a shawl around her shoulders, the faint aroma of tea mingling with the lavender sprigs she'd placed in a small vase on the mantel. Her knitting lay forgotten in her lap. She was waiting. The clock struck 8 when Sergeant Dacre appeared at her door, his boots leaving damp prints on the step. He looked tired but resolute. "It's done," he said without ceremony as she let him in. "They've finished the excavation and the papers are with the magistrate. There's enough there to tie Denham to the smuggling operation. Linton's letter fills in the rest. The Crown solicitor says it's an open and shut case." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "So it often seems in the daylight, Sergeant. But daylight is a deceptive thing. It shows what's obvious, not what's hidden in shadow." Dacre frowned, lowering himself into a chair. "You think something's still missing?" She poured him a cup of tea before answering. "Oh, not missing, merely unspoken. The truth as people tell it is rarely a single thread. It's more like a tapestry, with the most interesting bits on the back." He gave a wry smile. "You'll have to translate that into plain English for a policeman." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Plainly, Sergeant, I think we've mistaken who set the tragedy in motion. Denham may have struck the blow, but someone else handed him the weapon." Dacre stared at her. "You mean Mrs. Linton?" "I mean," she said softly, "that human beings seldom act in isolation. They are driven by fear, by love, by pride, or by guilt. We know that Mrs. Linton came back to claim her jewels and perhaps her dignity. We know Denham feared exposure and that Clara, poor child, feared for him. But there's one detail that doesn't rest easily." She rose, crossing to the small writing desk where the recovered letter lay under her care. "You remember this line? He suspects nothing. Once the jewels are in hand, meet me where the lavender grows." That wasn't written by Edgar Linton. It was written to him, but we've assumed it came from Beatrice. What if it didn't? Dacre blinked, but the letter was signed B. Who else could it have been? "Ah, Sergeant," she said gently, "you forget. There is another B. Dr. Fielding's handwriting, if you recall, has a very particular slope, and his signature, B. Fielding. The initial might belong to him as easily as to Beatrice." He sat up straighter. "You think the doctor wrote that note? Why would he?" Miss Marple turned the letter toward the light. "Because, my dear Sergeant, Beatrice wasn't the only one with something to hide. He admitted falsifying her death certificate. Yes, but what if that act bound him to her in a far darker way? Suppose he profited from the smuggling too. He was the only one in a position to arrange her disappearance legitimately. No one questions a doctor's word. And if he realized that Linton had kept evidence, the jewels, the papers, he might have needed to retrieve them before anyone else could." Dacre rose, pacing slowly. "So you think Fielding lured Linton out to the pond? That he wrote pretending to be Beatrice?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that he meant to meet Linton there, yes. But Denham arrived first. Perhaps he'd intercepted the message. Perhaps he was already suspicious. He confronted Linton, tempers flared, and what began as a quarrel turned fatal. When Fielding appeared, the deed was done, and rather than risk exposure himself, he let Denham shoulder the sin. It would have suited him quite well." Dacre rubbed a hand over his chin. "And now he's been helping us dig up the truth, steering it away from himself. Clever devil." "Doctors often are," Miss Marple said with mild regret. "They spend so much time diagnosing others that they grow quite skilled at disguising their own ailments." He looked at her in quiet admiration. "You mean to confront him?" "I dare say it would be impolite not to," she replied, reaching for her coat. "If one has discovered an untruth, the decent thing is to return it to its owner." They found Dr. Fielding in his surgery, writing at his desk. His expression when he saw them flickered briefly from politeness to wariness. "More questions, Sergeant? I thought the matter was settled." "Almost," Miss Marple said cheerfully. Only a few loose ends to tie up. I was thinking about that night, Doctor. The night Mrs. Linton came to you. You must have been quite surprised to see her alive after all these years." Fielding set down his pen. "Naturally. It's not every day the dead walk back into one's surgery." "Quite so," she said. "And yet you helped her once more. Helped her stay hidden, even as everything around her began to crumble. That's loyalty of a sort. Or perhaps something more?" He looked sharply at her. "What are you suggesting?" "That you loved her," Miss Marple said simply, "and that you believed you could protect her. But love built on deceit is a fragile house, Doctor. You forged her death for compassion's sake once. It's not so great a leap to imagine you'd forge the truth again. For survival's." Fielding's hand twitched toward the drawer of his desk, then stopped. "You're an old woman with a dangerous imagination, Miss Marple." "Perhaps," she said mildly. "But imagination has the inconvenient habit of aligning with fact. You see, the letter found with the jewels. It was written on your surgery's notepaper, a very particular watermark. And the handwriting, though you took care to disguise it, retains the same downward loop on the dough that appears in your signature. You might as well have signed your name in full." For a long moment there was silence. Then, very quietly, Fielding said, "I never meant for anyone to die." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Few ever do. But you lured Edgar Linton there under false pretenses, did you not? Hoping to recover what might expose you both. And when you arrived and saw Denham and Linton struggling, you let nature finish what your scheme began." The doctor sank back in his chair, the fight gone out of him. "I thought it was over," he said softly. 10 years ago, when I signed that certificate, I told myself I was giving her freedom. But freedom built on lies. Well, you're right, it decays. And when she came back, I saw how much I'd destroyed trying to save her." Sergeant Dacre stepped forward, his voice steady but not unkind. "You'll need to come with me, Doctor." Fielding nodded, defeated. "Yes, I suppose I will." When they left the surgery, the sun had broken through the mist, turning the rooftops to gold. Miss Marple walked slowly beside the sergeant, her face unreadable. "It's a pity," she said at last. "He wasn't wicked, only foolish. A man who believed he could mend one wrong with another." Dacre looked at her, half smiling. "You always see them as people, not villains." "Because that's what they are," she said quietly. "Villains are for stories, Sergeant. But in life it's mostly people. Lonely, frightened, and so desperate to preserve their little corner of happiness that they forget the cost." She reached her gate and paused, breathing in the faint scent of lavender drifting from the hedgerows. "It does make one rather grateful for simplicity, doesn't it?" she murmured. Dacre nodded. "Grateful, and a bit wary." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes kind. "That's the proper state for anyone, Sergeant. Grateful and wary." She watched him go, then turned back toward her cottage. Inside, the kettle was already beginning to sing, and she allowed herself a quiet sigh of satisfaction. The peace of Lavender Hill, so long disturbed, had at last settled again, though beneath the calm, as she knew better than most, human nature continued to bloom and wither in equal measure, as it always would. The trial came and went swiftly, as such things did when the evidence was tidy and the culprits already broken by conscience. Dr. Fielding's quiet confession to writing the letter, to manipulating the circumstances that drew both Denham and Linton to their ruin, left the court murmuring in disbelief. He had acted, he said, to protect Beatrice, though the truth of it was that he had sought to protect himself. From exposure, from love turned poisonous, from the echo of one dreadful mistake. The law, efficient if not merciful, saw to his punishment. Denham's death in custody shortly thereafter, heart failure, they said, closed the official record neatly. But life in St. Mildred's rarely allowed for neat endings. Gossip lingered like perfume after a visitor's departure. Beatrice left the village soon after, traveling under her true name at last, perhaps seeking the peace she had once faked with death. Clara Denham remained at the vicarage with her aunt, pale and reserved, her future uncertain, but freer than her past. The jewels, those glittering symbols of greed and guilt, were returned to the authorities, destined for some distant vault where their sparkle could offend no conscience again. Through it all, Miss Marple moved with her usual quiet grace. Her neighbors said she seemed less surprised by events than most, as though she had merely watched a play she'd already seen performed elsewhere, with only the costumes changed. On an afternoon of gentle sun and drifting clouds, she sat once more in her garden, a cup of tea at her elbow, the hum of bees stitching serenity through the air. Sergeant Dacre came up the path, hat in hand. "Everything's finished, Miss Marple. The papers are full of it. Doctor's deception at Lavender Hill, they're calling it. I half expected them to name you in it too." Miss Marple smiled. "Oh, my dear Sergeant, I've always found that attention spoils the flavor of satisfaction. One likes to know justice is done, but there's no need to shout about it." He laughed softly, then hesitated. "Still, I don't see how you manage it, knowing where to look, what to listen for." She set down her cup, her gaze wandering across the neat rows of lavender that bordered her garden. "It isn't cleverness, really," she said. "It's only paying attention. People show you what they are, if you let them. Mr. Denham, for instance, so desperate to preserve his reputation that he forgot honesty is the only thing that can't be stolen. Dr. Fielding thought himself noble for his deceit, and Mrs. Linton believed escape would grant her freedom. But you see, Sergeant, one can't run away from what one truly is." He considered that quietly. "You make it sound simple." "It isn't simple," she said gently, "but it is consistent. Human nature is the same everywhere. Pride, fear, and love. Those three will account for most sins if you look closely enough." A pause passed between them, filled only by the rustle of wind through lavender stalks. The air smelled faintly sweet, faintly bitter, like remembrance. Dacre straightened, tucking his notebook away. "Well, I suppose that's it then. Lavender Hill can sleep easy again." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, her eyes distant. "Though peace in a village is like mist on a pond, Sergeant. It returns, but never quite the same. Too many footsteps disturb the surface." He smiled faintly, tipped his hat, and left her there in the garden. She watched him go, then turned her attention back to her tea. For a long while she sat in thoughtful silence, the scent of lavender all around her, the sky paling to a soft silver above the hedgerows. She thought of Clara, of Beatrice, of all the hidden shames that fester beneath good manners and lace curtains. It was always the same, she reflected. Beneath the calm surface of English respectability, human hearts continued their quiet wars. And perhaps that was why she never grew weary of her small observations. Because beneath every teacup, every polite smile, there was a mystery waiting to be noticed. When the church bells began to chime the hour, she rose, setting her cup aside. The sound floated gently across the green, mingling with the scent of her garden. She looked once more toward the distant rise of Lavender Hill, now softened by sunlight, and allowed herself the faintest of smiles. "Poor souls," she murmured. "They all meant well in their fashion. But one should never bury secrets where flowers grow. They always find their way back to the light." And with that, Miss Marple went inside, her footsteps light, her thoughts serene. The garden behind her stirred faintly in the breeze, the lavender swaying as though nodding in agreement. And in that peaceful corner of St. Mildred's, the world seemed, for the moment, exactly as it ought to be, quiet, lovely, and safe under the watchful eyes of an old woman who understood too well the fragile balance between innocence and sin.